Welcome. My name is Scott Lewis. I'm the CEO and Editor-in-Chief at The Voice of San Diego. We're a nonprofit, investigative, and explanatory news site. We try to help you find out things people don't want you to find out and explain things that sometimes people make a little too complicated. So that's what we're going to do today, is try to help people understand this complicated issue. I got to say, this is my first in-person event like this. I did these every other day for years and years, and then it just suddenly stopped, and I had to remember how to put on all my clothes and everything. But I'm very excited to be here and have a real conversation with some really smart people about an important issue. So let me introduce who's here, and then we'll have, my goal with all these conversations is always to make sure people understand things. So we're going to start very broad and then get higher and higher level and have some good follow-ups, I hope. So I'm going to introduce everybody here. To my left is Nathan Fletcher. He's the chair of the Board of Supervisors of San Diego County. Welcome, Nathan. Next to him is Stephan. She's the DA, the district attorney for San Diego County. Welcome, Summer. Great to see you. It's been a while. Next to her, Dan Langford. He is the executive secretary treasurer and CEO of the Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters. Welcome, Dan. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Scott.
And then to his left, Pete Rodriguez. He's the president and COO of the Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters. Hello, Pete.
Thank you, Scott.
And then next to him, to his left, is Bob Caya. He's the president and CEO of Standard Drywall. Hey, Bob. Great to see you. And then finally, on the end there, David Kersh. He's the executive director of the Carpenters Contractors Cooperation Committee. Hey, David. How are you?
Good, thank you.
All right, so let's do that. Let's start from the very basic, what we're talking about here. I'm going to turn to you, Dan. Help us think for a second. Help us explain, what is it we're talking about? You've mentioned tax fraud. We've heard words like wage theft. We've heard all kinds of things like that. But what exactly are you saying is occurring that we need to understand on a broader level? How does it relate to taxes? How does it relate to wages?
Thanks, Scott. And first, I want to say it's a real pleasure to be here in San Diego. At the Carpenters Union, we call San Diego America's finest union city. So the Carpenters Union, on a national level, started the Tax Fraud Day of Action, and we make it an annual event. Tax fraud happens in many industries, but especially in the construction industry, and especially when you get into the multi-family, single-family housing market. It starts with immigrant abuse, cash pay. It's just it's bad across the board for the contractors that are trying to compete and play by the rules. And with union contractors, they're the ones that put our members to work. And our members make good middle-class wages. They have good benefits. So they bring value to the community, where contractors that commit tax fraud, wage fraud, immigrant abuse, they take away from the committee. So with anything, we think it's up to us to bring this out of the darkness and into the light, so people in the community understand what's going on and understand how it affects them, even if they don't work in construction. When tax dollars aren't paid, it means that schools don't get built. It means fire stations don't get built. It means that you can't hire more people that work for a safer community. So tax fraud affects everybody in the community.
So Pete, help me understand. So what is actually happening on a job site where something like this is going on, where tax fraud or wage theft is going on? Are there paychecks being handed out, or is there cash being handed out? What does it actually look like?
So tax fraud is obviously the slogan, right? Because it's everybody can relate to it one way or the other. What actually happens on the job site is you have criminal contractors that basically are awarded projects. How are they awarded projects? Is they undermine the bidding system. They have a workforce that is vulnerable and usually not able to speak up for themselves. The workers are paid in cash, and if there's a check, many times the checks are written under somebody else's name. And if you're fortunate enough to get a check in your name in it, the chances are that you're probably responsible to pay somebody else a certain portion from that check. That's some of the small, well, not some of the small, but those are some of the ways that a contractor is able to get away with undermining the tax system, take advantage of the workers, and definitely be abusive to those workers that live in the shadows.
You're saying they're paying people less, they're actually signing the checks over to other people. What do you mean, like there's a check, I did work, it's written out to Joe instead of Scott? How does that look exactly?
So I'm a carpenter. I'm working on a residential project in downtown San Diego. I put in my 60 hours for the week, and I'm responsible. I'm going to get a check from the contractor, and I'm responsible to pay my partner that worked with me those 60 hours, because we're really not being paid hourly. We're being paid by the piece, or we're being paid per day. Many times the check doesn't reflect actually what's actually being paid hourly. It's usually, it'll be a reflection of what's going to be reported to the IRS or to the certified payroll system.
And Dan, what you're talking about there is that you're talking about they're trying to lower their costs by lowering what they're paying people by not having to pay these taxes and these benefits.
Right. They can't go to the lumber yard and say, hey, we're only going to pay you half of what you're charging us for the lumber or the concrete. So it always falls back on the worker. And one thing that really exposed how sad that is that when we went into the pandemic, those workers that are being paid cash, they didn't get a stimulus check, right? Because they didn't submit a tax return. They didn't get unemployment benefits, that extra unemployment, because there was no hours reported to them on unemployment. So it was really exposed during the pandemic.
Got it. David, maybe you can help me understand this too. So there's a lot of different things going on. Sometimes when there's undocumented workers on a site, it's not that they're not paying some of these taxes. Often they're paying taxes, but through other forms of identification. But what you're talking about here is when that's literally even more under the table, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with situations where we're not talking about like one or two workers on a job site. I mean, we're talking about, hundreds of workers performing work. And so what you have is, let's say one check is being made out to one person, and that one check is covering, 4, 5, 6 people. You start multiplying that, and I'm a contractor. I have 300 workers. I have my tax obligations, my workers' comp obligations, and that's a certain amount for the bid. But if you could take 300 workers and you're actually only paying, you're paying taxes on a fraction of that, you're working workers' comp, you're saving significantly. So it's being driven by the ability to have checks that are not lining up with the worker, and you can have one check that can cover 10 workers. You have other scenarios where workers worked last year, and the contractor's still using that person's information to pay other workers. And so it's kind of funneling the payment among different workers. But I guess at the root of it is a legitimate contractor has, you have like one worker, there's workers' comp, there's tax. It all lines up. It's much more transparent. This creates a significant savings, and therefore that's when it impacts the legitimate contractors who can't compete, because it's such a huge savings that you can make by having these schemes where you're paying a lot of workers in cash or using other folks' identity to pay them.
Is there a way to spot that? Like if you're looking at a job site and they say like, oh, there's only 25 workers here, when in fact you can obviously see that there's more or something like that?
Well, a lot of the times, and this is where we come in, the developer community, the contractors, they want to look away because they benefit. And so my operation involves field reps, visiting workers, getting information, trying to recreate the scene to figure out what's really going on in order to be able to figure out what's going on. Because unfortunately, a lot of developers, general contractors, are benefiting from this, which is sort of why we're working on legislation that has the liability moving upward, because I think there's a lot of people that know that it's happening, but you're profiting from it, so you choose to look the other way. So I think folks know it's happening, But it takes people like our organization to be able to recreate the scene, because you need to be able to take worker statements, you need to be able to look at checks, you need to be kind of sort of recreate the situation in order to be able to get the full picture of what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of those contractors. So, Bob, you're involved with that. You have to bid on these projects. You have to compete. What does it look like when you are competing against somebody who might be doing something like this?
Well, it's quite honestly, it's disheartening. You know, when we're looking at some of these projects, which, to be honest with you, we tend to stay away from most of them. Our estimators will go, well, we don't have a chance at getting this job. Why would we bid it? And from my perspective, it's like, well, what do you mean we don't have a chance? And then we bid it, and we see that consistently. I mean, we're giving up. I've kind of done the figures on it. If somebody's not paying workers' compensation on their workers, if, you know, all the different things, if they're paying cash, they're not paying taxes, you're looking at the difference consistently of at least 30% difference in the same bids, but you just take those things out. So when we're bidding against that, obviously we're not going to be, you know, even close. And the problem with it is the developers, they're counting on those numbers to make their pro formas work for their thing. So even if they want to change it, the numbers will go up, and then that's why they say, hey, there's not going to be a project if, you know, if those guys can't do that.
How do you know? Like, you said somebody will come and say, like, hey, we can't even compete for this. How do you even know?
How do I know that we can't compete?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we'll bid. I mean, in California and here in San Diego, that work tends to be in a certain category: multifamily, residential, you know, type 5 wood frame type things.
Let's translate a little bit. So we're talking about apartments, talking about homes in sprawling subdivisions,
Condominiums,
talking about
towers. You know,
Okay,
it can even come in that downtown. It doesn't. It's not in a certain area. It's just that type of work, and it's kind of almost understood that type of work. You know, a union contractor or even a responsible contractor. We have a unique thing that 20 years ago we were non-union here in San Diego. So I competed against those people then, or tried to, and I still couldn't. It wasn't a union non-union issue. It's a, you know, a legal illegal issue.
Yeah. So just to be clear, you are a union shop now.
We are a union shop now. Yeah.
Okay, good. Hey, so for those of you watching, we want to hear from you. Maybe you're not buying some of it. Maybe you want to get some more information about something that's being said. Anything like that, let me know. I've got a little device here, and we can do it. It's not Zoom. You can't mute me or mute yourself, but you can put it in there. We'll figure it out. So a lot of this is already against the law. Summer Stephan, you are the chief law enforcement officer for state law in San Diego. What are you doing already to take care of some of this stuff? We can talk about future laws that might need to be dealt with, but it seems like we can take care of some of this stuff without that.
Absolutely. This is a big problem, you know, and the way you have to think about it is this just unravels the economy for everybody, but it also affects real people. And for me as DA, it's about people. And so the key to this is that the people who are cheating on their tax roll, especially in this situation of payroll, they only have half their employees on the tax payroll. That's what we see. The other half are not on the payroll at all. So they're showing up to the job sites. They're not accounted for. That's a huge savings. When you have those employees not on the payroll, you save because you're cheating the tax system. You save because you can commit wage theft more easily because these employees are kind of anonymous. If you pay them the minimum wage or don't, they don't really have a voice. And then you're also cheating because you're not paying medical, you're not paying workers' comp. So it's affecting that particular employee, but it's affecting the system. It's affecting these guys that are trying to do an honest day's work and pay their employees the right way. So we take it very seriously. We have been engaged in this work, but we've just upped the way we do it. We've really heard the stories, and we've seen the damage. We've seen employees that are injured on the job, and they're being threatened that if you go and get medical care, we're going to fire you, you're going to lose your job, we're going to report you to immigration. That is just unacceptable. So we've now have a dedicated unit, workplace justice unit, that we launched with Chair Fletcher in order to bring more of a voice and more strength and accountability to this very large issue. Actually, payroll fraud is the largest fraud in California. It ties with insurance fraud. It's about $9 billion worth.
And put most simply, payroll fraud, what you're referring to is you're literally not paying people what they would get if they were following the law. So can you talk about any specific cases you've had that you've been able to tackle, approaching this? Or is it usually somebody call in and say, hey, this job site is bad, or this developer's bad, or how does it usually happen? What's a case that comes to mind?
Well, there are several cases, but by forming this unit, because we realize the number one obstacle is retaliation, we've received already 11 messages, 11 tips to our special site. So kind of realizing that the DA has your back, so you have a place to report has been very important. But let me give you an example. This happens in every field, but the largest case that we did in this area was a janitorial company. This janitorial company was bidding, and they actually had the contracts for almost every large hotel in San Diego. Why? Because it's 40% less than legitimate people that are bidding. And what they had their employees, half of them off the books. They were committing wage theft. They were threatening and abusing them when they got injured with the chemical products. And we brought felony actions against them and were able to actually get prison sentences and an amount of restitution. That's one example. But we have to ask the question here, do the people who are allowing this bidding know, the hotels? Of course. I mean, how are you going to get a bid that's 40% less? So there should be accountability all over the place.
And how would you do that, though? How would you hold a hotel or a developer accountable?
Well, I think that we have to start with ourselves, with government, with even the government contracts. And I think Chair Fletcher has been doing something about that, to set the example that you're not going to allow that transparency. For me, as you know, human trafficking is a big issue. And one of the ways you hide labor trafficking and child trafficking is through these kinds of abuses and this kind of fraud, because there's no transparency in the system. In construction, there's no safety equipment. We see those types of injuries. So it has a ripple effect. It's not just dollars, it's actually about people getting hurt and not having dignity in their work.
So, Chair Fletcher, great to see you in person again. I talk a lot about this cost of living crisis we have in San Diego. There's the water bills, the housing, power, cars, car insurance, gas. Everything is so expensive. But on the other side, people always say, well, people also need to make more money. And so when you look at this issue, what we're talking about is people not even getting their basic sort of minimum wage that we've passed in these things. What is the role of local government, though, with this? This seems like a statewide, national law issue.
Well, I mean, some of it, look, it's illegal to steal people's money. I mean, it's already illegal, right? I mean, the things that we're talking about happening, there's already laws. Now, we got to tighten them up and do better. The question is, how do you ensure better accountability? Because, Scott, at its core, it's just greed, right? I mean, what we're talking about is greed. So people want to profit, and so they figure out a way where they can exploit the worker to increase their own profits. And too often what we have, and this isn't the only instance, where we privatize the profit and we socialize the cost, right? So we allow this to happen, but that worker who gets hurt, they're still going to end up in our healthcare system. They're just not going to do it through workers' comp, right? And that family, I mean, and then the rest of us are bearing the cost for that. And so I think that's where we have to step up to do a lot more. So we started with a simple premise. One of the first actions we took was for construction projects, you are going to disclose all of the names of your subcontractors, all of them, and you're going to verify that they're compliant. Now, you would think the simple notion of requiring a general contractor to just disclose who your subs are, everyone would be like, yeah, that makes sense, that's easy. oh my God, go listen to the testimony. You would have thought we were ending the world because people are choosing to look away. And they're subbing it out to these irresponsible subcontractors who, you know, the janitor example, same thing happens on job sites. I've talked to janitors who said they're supposed to have 30 janitors here to clean this building. And they bill 30 janitors, but there's only 15 of us and they make us work twice as much. And then they say, well, we're just not paying you for all the hours. Or we're gonna pay you one check for 2 of you, as was just said. Or you get the check and then the check bounces. And then when you actually go to investigate, this whole subcontractor company just disappears. It's just gone, poof, it just disappears. And the general contractor is like, well, I don't know, I don't know, we'll have to look. And so we're doing things on subcontractor transparency, but we're also coming back, because you said something earlier that was so profound. Could someone go look at that job site and say, well, that doesn't make sense? They could, but who is that person? Who is that entity that actually sees all the laws being followed? And so I'm bringing another action before the county to create an Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement, where we can actually go out and verify, are people complying? What are the labor laws? Are they being followed? How do we make sure on government contracts that if you take a contract, you have an obligation to ensure the people you sub it out to are being responsible. You know, and we hold you accountable. Well, if you start holding them accountable, then they'll start holding the subs accountable, and then we'll have less of these conditions. So I actually think there's a lot we can do at the local level.
Yeah.
And I think the threat of prosecution, and this is why I commend the DA, the Workplace Justice Initiative, that threat of prosecution. You do a couple high-profile prosecutions, and some people actually go to jail, and then folks start getting nervous, right? I mean, I heard this line one time. They said, you got to, like, kill a chicken to keep the monkeys in line. Like, you got to make an example to say, hey, someone's watching, and there are consequences for your action. And I think if we start getting more of that going, and we start proactively doing it, and we provide the transparency piece of it, then I think we'll start getting a higher degree of accountability.
So we have to kill chickens.
Yeah, to keep the monkeys in line. But I'm telling you, but if Summer goes out and starts putting some people in jail,
Okay.
people are going to be like, hold on, how much is that profit worth? Is it worth me going to jail? No, I don't think it's worth me going to jail. Maybe I'll pay minimum wage. Maybe I'll do workers' comp. Maybe I'll pay into the UI system. And at the end of the day, it cost us all the money anyway.
Well, so I can hear people talking already in my head. We talk about this cost of living, cost of building housing is so high. Right. And I can hear them saying, like, if you put another office, another inspector out, another thing we have to go through, it's just going to make it harder to build. It's going to make it harder to build affordable housing. Everything's going to be more expensive. What's the response to that?
That you can't traffic humans in order to make your housing cheaper. Like, it's not okay to steal from somebody. I mean, the question on that, the flip side would be, okay, then I can go to the grocery store and pay for half of my cart of groceries and the other half I'm going to shoplift because it's cheaper for me to do it. But if they got to charge me for all the produce in my basket, well, that's too expensive. No, because you can't break the law. No one comes in and says, hey, it's okay to steal from your employer. It's okay, we're going to look the other way because you know what? If you don't steal from your employer, then how are you going to make your ends meet? But when it goes the other way and we say you got to treat your people, I mean, and we're talking basic labor standards. Like, don't human traffic, pay them the minimum wage, give them a check on time. We're not talking about extravagant stuff, but it's only when it comes to the worker being exploited that we have this debate. If it comes to the employee stealing from the employer, oh, everyone's like, yeah, lock them up.
Let me ask you, Summer, so how realistic is it to imagine, is this like an actual criminal felony? Is this something you could go to jail for?
Yes, it is a criminal. I mean, workers' comp fraud, tax fraud, those are all felonies. And then also stealing over $950. In San Diego, we've interpreted it that way, and we've won. But the laws aren't clear, and there's some laws coming that are going to clarify that if you steal $950+ of somebody's wages, then that's also wage theft.
So if you were running one of these subcontractors that's doing this, that's paying 10 people with 5 checks, that's, doing what you've described, how realistic is it to imagine the leader of that going to jail?
Well, it's not hard to imagine because we've done it. We did the first wage theft case, and it was a guy who was employing college students. So it's not it's immigrants, it does affect them, but it affects everyday people. And he had these training periods where, you know, you're going to just work for 3 months, and if you do great, then I'll start paying you. And then he would fire them at the end of the 3 months. And so that was a case, that was a wage theft case. It was the first in the state. And he did go to jail. It was a 5-year sentence. So it is serious, but you have to take it seriously. And most DA's offices don't take it seriously because they haven't seen the human damage and face behind it. Yeah. So they're looking at, you know, the theft from the grocery stores as being more important. And in my mind, this is more important because you're actually destroying that person's life and their ability to put food on the table.
One quick thing on this, though. The other challenge is the workers have to be willing to come forward. And if that job is the only job you have, and that really low substandard cash pay is the only pay you have, then you're reluctant. I learned a lesson in COVID that I'm applying to this situation. So we had a problem in a lot of the Latino community and immigrant community where folks weren't getting tested. And I thought, my God, why is no one getting tested? We're making it, it's free, we're doing it at the consulate and the diocese and the church. And then someone said, because if you test positive and you can't go to work and you're not eligible for UI, your choice is protect your public health or feed your family. Well, you're going to choose feed your family. So we launched an income replacement fund. We said, if you test positive, we will pay you cash, no questions asked, equivalent to 2 weeks of UI for that period you got to quarantine. And then we saw our numbers come up because then people didn't have to choose between feeding their family and protecting their public health. So we come into this now, and a part of what I want in our Office of Labor Standard Enforcement is a worker fund where if you come forward and saying, I'm being exploited on the job site, and they go to investigate and that employer fires you or dissolves, we're going to make you whole because otherwise no one's going to come forward. Because even though they're barely making it, that's still what feeds their kids. Yeah. And you can't put people in that choice of saying, do I report the abuse or not?
Pete, let me ask you what it's like to talk to workers in this situation. You know, they're dealing with sometimes stress is bigger than the question of some bureaucracy or something. They're dealing with life or death. They're dealing with feeding their family. What kind of conversations do you have to have with them?
So many times those that do get prosecuted is the hand itself, right? It's the foreman that's responsible for the job site because their super or their managers basically asking them who has the ability to communicate with the workers to conduct that crime or to mess around with the payroll and so forth. When it comes down time for the criminal charges to come through and you have to show up to court, you'll never see a contractor show up without an attorney. But you will see the hand show up basically looking at his boss saying, what about me? And he's on his own. He or she's on their own. And what they're doing is basically, ye with the most money shall not go to jail. When we speak to the workers, it's usually at their home. There's hesitance because they're afraid of the consequences, like Chair Fletcher just brought up right now. And it's not just, I want to be clear, it's not just an immigration issue. You got folks that get taken advantage of because they're behind on child support, and they don't want to. You know, there's a double dip there, right? They don't want to be called to the mat because they don't want to have to catch up on child support or have to be deducted their wages and so forth. You've got folks contractors that have forced their employees or have laid them off so that way their employee could take advantage of the unemployment stimulus check that came down from the government, and they're getting paid in cash. How's Standard Drywall going to compete with that contractor, and how's a union carpenter going to compete with that hand to hand on a level playing field? You just can't do it. And the workforce, as much as they want to speak up on their own behalf, it's survival at this point. And if we don't have enforcement, if we don't have something that puts these criminal contractors in jail, it's just going to be a slippery slope. I love affordable housing and the concept of it, but I'll speak on behalf of the workforce, and they'll tell you, we want to be able to afford that housing. We don't want a giveaway. We don't want anything that comes with the key and so forth. We want to be able to pay our mortgage, put our families to school, and put food on the table with dignity.
David, I want to ask you about, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to add, you know, the thing that Pete was talking about with a lot of these guys too is they're frightened to come forward for some of the reasons you talked about, but some of them are threatened, and that's what makes it really sad, you know, and very difficult. The only people that can really police it, I know, Nathan, you were talking about having a government thing, but the union, really, we do work in 5 different states, and where the union is strongest seems to be policed the best, where the workers are not afraid, whether they're illegal immigrant or they're legal, whatever, they're not afraid to speak up. And I think that's really important. You know, a worker's rights, I mean, there can be that question about whether an illegal worker shouldn't be here, shouldn't be here, but the reality is they're building our housing.
Yeah.
And shouldn't they be paid, you know, in accordance to our laws here?
Yeah.
And it's important that enforcement comes with boots on the ground. Everything that we're discussing here, I applaud it as loud as I possibly can, but enforcement can't be conducted from behind a desk. It needs investigators on the job sites, asking questions, checking, counting hard hats. I would even say that the investigators have the authority as a healthcare or health inspector at a restaurant. If they see that there's some sort of anomaly, some sort of criminal activity that's going on the job site, they would have the authority to shut the job down. And that would be a great first step towards enforcement and compliance.
Summer, you have to deal with this a lot, I assume, in a lot of different areas, but we are talking about, kind of dancing around sometimes, a population of people, unauthorized immigrants who are here who do feel uniquely vulnerable, I'm assuming, in certain ways. And you have to deal with that in all kinds of settings. What can you do to make somebody in a situation like that feel like they can speak up about their situation without, you know, dealing with recriminations or something, or blowing the whistle if they have to?
Yeah, it is a big challenge. I mean, that's what all the studies and our own reality tells us, is that people are afraid of retaliation, and especially if someone is undocumented. They don't know that the laws apply to them equally, that there's no differentiation in the state law, that you only pay minimum wage and do all of your other legal responsibilities if somebody is a legal resident. That's not the law. But they don't know that, and in fact the employer thrives on them not knowing that and using that threat. So what we do is we work with the NGOs on the ground, with the Employee Rights Center, and with the regional carpenters. We have a case, and I can't talk about it because it's pending, but the victim was so afraid, he didn't want to come to our office. So we sent our investigators to interview this victim at their office with people he trusted, or she. So it is really, the way to do it is to think outside the box, to realize, to put yourself in those shoes, and to not go the traditional come to the police department route, but rather work with the people that are trusted, with sometimes a language translator, to earn the trust and to get that case done.
Dan, let's talk about something else that's kind of unstated here. Bob mentioned it as well, that things are easier, they're cleaner, easier to enforce when there is a union present. Is a lot of this, though, about you trying to increase the footprint of the union, make sure that the union has more power, more leverage in some of these situations? How can you help people understand that it might be bigger than that, or what you're actually talking about?
Yeah. And there was a time that all we cared about was union contractors and union members. And everything we did was to increase our membership and increase our market share. But we have gone and made a transition where we are concerned about our communities. And we found out that the health of our community led to the health of our union. So when we go out and represent a worker that's being exploited or being paid cash, there's no, we're only going to help you if you become a union member. That's not it. We help people that need help the most. And when you talk about there's less of the criminal activity going on when there's a higher union density, it's true. In Los Angeles, you're not going to find cash pay on a highway job, a high-rise job, a school, a hospital. We still have it going on in the residential industry, but we have the resources. We have our staff to go out and, like I said, bring that to the light of day. But we also have jurisdiction in Colorado and Utah, and Bob will tell you that in Utah, in Salt Lake City, I mean, it's the Wild West. There's probably more criminal activity, tax fraud, cash pay going on in Salt Lake City or in Denver, Colorado than any other place in the country. And that's because we just don't have the union density. Where in Southern California, I have 60 or 70 staff people that can go out and do these investigations. In Denver, I think we have 4 or 5 staff, and in Salt Lake City we have 3 because we just don't have the contractor base to justify any more than that.
Got it. David, I have a question I think you could address from the audience here, but maybe you could start just, your organization is related to the Carpenters, a little separate though. What is it?
We're a labor management organization, so we're comprised of both the union contractors and the union. So we operate separately, but we're promoting sort of the mutual interest of both parties to make sure that there's fair competition and a level playing field. And so we're out there policing the industry, working with the different enforcement agencies. So we're not the contractors, we're not the union. We're made up of both to promote the mutual interests.
Got it. So we have a question here from one of the audience. Says, why can't we police projects on a daily basis? Really just have like kind of ubiquitous presence of this threat to make sure they follow the rules.
Well, we do police it on a daily basis. There's only obviously so much that can be done. I mean, we've become much more strategic. We do a lot of the legwork beforehand in regards to doing market analysis and researching and trying to figure out who the key bad players are in order to better utilize our resources. So we are on the ground on a daily basis. Our staff is talking to workers at their homes or visiting projects, and so it's a question of being strategic and figuring out how to best utilize our resources. So, but we need good partners in government, and that's why we're very fortunate that we have, District Attorney's Office and supervisors, and we work very closely with the Labor Commissioner's Office. So, yes, as was mentioned before, you need boots on the ground, and so that's where all our energy is, and just a question of being strategic and effective.
So you hinted at it, Summer, and you hinted at it, David. Laws. What actual laws could be clarified to make this easier? I'll start with you, and then I'd like to hear from the district attorney.
Well, there's 2. One is that we're working on is in regards to general contractor liability. As I was saying, I mean, you can go after a subcontractor after subcontractor, and you never really get to the root of the problem. The only way that we're going to change the industry is by having the general contractor realize that there's a price to pay for who you're hiring. From a big picture, cleaning up the industry, that's how we've been approaching it in regards to having the liability go upward. The other one has...
Just to be clear, you're talking about the ability to sue them and have them pay for what they've done.
Yes, it's already existing law that the general contractor is liable for subcontractors' wage violations. We're trying to tighten it up and make it stronger in order to make it more effective.
Got it. Summer, what would you add?
Well, as Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez has a bill right now that would clarify that stealing money from an employee, 950 and above, is wage theft, is a felony. So under the law, we've interpreted grand theft to include wage theft, but it's not spelled out. And so while our DA's office interprets it that way, that's not the way that is done across the state, and because it's not directly stated and it's not clear. And so this will give us an additional tool, and it'll make all of the information we put out there that this is a crime much more crystal clear, and maybe serve as a deterrent to those that are regularly committing wage theft.
You and Nathan have used the word trafficking and human trafficking a couple of times here, and I am a little bit guarded that we're letting that term encompass too many things. So why is that term appropriate in this setting? What do you actually mean when you say a human has been trafficked?
Right. So it's on a continuum. So when you are abusing an employee and committing injustices, at the other extreme is labor or human trafficking. So the additional elements, so you steal somebody's wages, but if you add to that coercion, duress, force, like the threats against you, that turns it from a wage theft to a labor trafficking case.
It's an idea of consent, really, right?
Exactly.
Whether you're an adult making a transaction with peace of mind, or whether you're being bullied or otherwise coerced into it.
Deceived, exactly. And we had some employees in a health care system where they were told they're going to work a normal job and get paid. Instead, they essentially worked 24 hours a day and were threatened that they can't leave. They lived, worked in the same place. So that turns it closer to a labor trafficking case. So that's why we put it under the workplace justice, so that the victims out there don't have to figure out what is my crime. They just know something is happening that's not right. And they report to us, and then we're able to actually frame it with what does the law says, and where does this fall? Is it a misdemeanor, a felony, or is it a very serious felony like labor trafficking?
Nathan, can you describe the group? You've got a question here about an oversight committee that might be needed. Can you describe the group that you're actually forming?
Yeah.
Like literally how many people, what we're talking about they would do?
Yeah.
And then how far are you willing to go, both of you?
Well, I think, creating an Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement at the county. I mean, look, when I came into the county, we didn't have business license, we didn't have tobacco retail license. I mean, it's kind of been the Wild West in a lot of these in terms of, is there going to be any sort of oversight or regulation to ensure there's conformity with the existing laws? And so we're proposing the creation of an Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement. And a part of that is we've got to develop how many people are needed to be able to go in. Because I don't think you have to go to every job site every day. But if you know you got to be transparent with who your subs are, and you know you're going to be on the hook if they do something wrong, and you know that there's a reasonable chance someone could show up, and you know if you do wrong, the DA may put you in jail. Well, those combination of things can all be transformative. But at the county level, I mean, we have all these rules, we have all these things. There should be some entity that has the ability to go out and say, are they doing it? Are they not doing it? The other thing is we've got to build out in our county infrastructure an entity that can advise the board on, hey, these are the best policies when it comes to labor enforcement. Hey, this is what you ought to be doing, that can work with all of the stakeholder groups. So, I mean, just in the last 6 months, we've created an Office of Racial Equity and Justice. We're looking to create an Office of Natural Resources. We created an Office of Homeless. And so it's realigning our county government to be focused in a way that they never have been. And I think that's essential. And, you know, to Summer's point on this, Scott, if somebody is an immigrant and the person they're working for takes their paperwork and says, I'm not going to give it back to you, right? And if you turn me in, I'll shred your forms. Or if they get someone and they say, well, yeah, you may be legal, but I know your mom's not, so you're going to do what I tell you, or I will report you to CBP. That is duress. I mean, that is, in my mind, that is human trafficking, and it's very real, you know, what's happening to the workers. And then when they consistently can underbid, then they consistently get the work. You know, and you just create this perpetual system, and then the folks that are doing it right, you know, can't. And so I think this is important, and we're going to do everything we can. I'm going to propose everything I can, and hopefully have board support behind a whole series of these measures that, you know, a few we've already taken and more are coming up.
Scott, can I add something? One of the things, too, that's different, I was thinking as Nathan, you were talking, one of the things that we see on the commercial side where there isn't a lot of this is that the owners require the general contractors and the generals require us as subcontractors to provide payment and performance bonds. And quickly what that is that just ensures that we're going to pay for the performance of that job. We're going to pay all of our bills in essence. And so in order to do that, the insurance companies require us to have a net worth to our business, where on the residential side, the multifamily side, those contractors change the corporations every 5 years so that any liability, and they don't leave any net worth in the company, so that if somebody in the government were to go after them, they just bankrupt and there's nothing there. They're not losing anything.
Yeah.
Where if there was a payment of performance bond or a developer was held responsible, he then would require those things, which would require a more responsible contractor that's going to ensure that those things get paid, either through an insurance policy. And so I think those are some of the things too that can be.
Well, and on that, I mean, that triggered a thing. My wife's working on a thing where if you have an outstanding wage claim, you can't form a new business. Right? Because if you're an irresponsible sub and let's say someone comes after you, will you just dissolve that company? And then maybe you get a wage claim attached to you, will you just go create a new company under a different name and you keep doing it?
And it happens.
And there aren't enough checks and it takes too long for the system to catch up with you and you fight it in court long enough. I mean, that's an interesting.
Hold up. So we're talking, this kind of blowing my mind. So this idea of like a business just disappearing, can somebody explain to me what's happening here? Like, so you're working with a subcontractor and then something comes up and they just disappear?
Yeah, I mean, you lose your license and you have your sister-in-law name on the license. I mean, in terms of these sectors of the construction industry, this kind of Wild West feel is very common. Forget Colorado, where it's like a whole other extreme, where you just create an LLC and you dissolve your LLC and you just keep going from one fake company to another fake company. But even here, there is a lot of fluidity in regards to being able to get impact. You know, you have a case against you. You go ahead and you just dissolve your company, you start another one, and you have your sister-in-law because you need a contractor's license, you just find somebody else to start up a contractor license, and then you are in the shadows. I mean, we have a situation right now where, you know, sort of a repeat offender where they put the kids' names on the license, and then we have a new criminal case with the Orange County District Attorney's Office where the kids got dragged into the criminal case because they put their name on the license. So we got to figure out these ways in which we take these sort of lessons from the more responsible parts of the industry and try to figure out those areas that need more cleanup.
Bob, let me ask you. So you have to work with subcontractors all the time, right? How do you know that they're legit or not? Is it union? Is it net worth like you described? How can a person trying to do right in your world do right?
Well, I mean, and that's what I was kind of alluding to, where in some of the stuff Nathan was talking about, where they're making some adjustments in the laws and things, holding the developers accountable. What the developers are going to do then is they're going to then require the subs to be responsible, and that will be done through insurance policies, which is payment and performance bonds. And in order to get those and to have a surety line of credit, in essence, it's like a bank line of credit. You have to have something in your company, you have to have some personal interest, and so for us, you know, when we look at responsible contractors, yes, in San Diego, especially on the commercial side, it's predominantly union. It's not all union, so there's responsible contractors that are non-union as well, but they all can provide those payment and performance bonds. They can. There's something in the company. You just don't see it because they won't get the awards on that side because of that responsibility. I think if that's brought on towards the housing side, I think it's going to bring a more responsible contractor to that side of the fence, and you're going to see you won't see any of this again. Because you'll lose your business, you might go to jail. I mean, you know, all these things that we've been talking about today.
Pete, when we look at some of these sites, I have a question here. What steps can we take to implement compliance just, you know, locally? How could you look at a site and make sure something's going better? Is there anything that the broader public or workers or developers can do?
I'll just describe it. The shorter the building is, the higher the increase of tax fraud going on in the building. You find me a tract home or a development throughout San Diego County, I could probably find you some tax fraud or somebody being cheated their wages. We could go to downtown San Diego right now. You find me the shortest building in town that's being worked on, I could probably find you something that's going on there as well. How do you see it from layman's eyes? The workers that we're talking about live in the shadows. They're working in the shadows. They're afraid to come out and speak for themselves. It's important that us as leadership and us as the community voice, again, I'll go back to the boots on the ground, that we're willing to go in the shadows and have those conversations and have the staffing that's able to communicate effectively, right, in the native language of the worker that's performing the work. You know, how does a contractor disappear? You explained. For the layman's person that's sitting at home, everybody's known or it's done something has had work performed in their home, and they understand when the contractor doesn't show up as scheduled. Well, imagine that in the larger scale. Contractor gets in trouble, workers are filing mechanic liens or whatever the case may be, and all of a sudden they jump ship, they leave town.
Well, there's another aspect of this we haven't talked about, which is the safety aspect. You know, the worker safety on a job site when it's a responsible person, but also the safety of the building. I mean, the structural integrity of the building and I mean that's a part that I think plays into this as well.
Dan, is there something weird about construction? What is it about construction that makes what Pete said about its proliferation of this sort of corruption so, you know, prevalent?
Yeah, I wish it wasn't in the construction industry, but it is. Construction is hard, dirty, dangerous work. And people that have nothing left to lose are willing to do hard, dangerous, dirty work. So there's always shadows. It will be obvious. And to go back about how can you see it? If you walk onto a standard drywall job and you look at the drywallers, the way they're dressed, the protective equipment that they have on, the tools that they work with, you walk in, you go, that's a union job or that's a responsible contractor. If you go out to one of these multi-residential projects, you know, guys will be wearing tennis shoes. They'll be hanging up in the air. They won't have a safety harness on. It's just obvious. The professionalism of a union job or a job with a professional contractor as opposed to a contractor that pays their workers cash or exploits them. Through the trained eye, they're easy to pick out.
So it's not just construction. It's not just construction. I mean, look, it's in landscaping. It's in janitorial. It's a low-wage issue, right? When you can exploit low-wage workers in heavy manual requirement duties, it's in home care and nannies. I mean, it really is much more pervasive, you know, in terms of the low-wage sector of work, and I think we see it throughout. We're talking about construction today, but I think it's in a lot.
The other thing I wanted to mention too is that, like even for our union membership. Close to 55% of our membership is Hispanic. The new membership coming in is almost 80%. So when you talk about immigrant abuse, taking care of those that don't, or taking advantage of those that don't have proper documentation, that's another reason why construction is ripe with the problems that we have.
Mm-hmm. And the studies support that. I mean, it's interesting that it's the #1 area of wage theft. Construction. It's also the #1 area of labor trafficking. So two separate studies, you know, but it kind of puts it on this continuum. It's in every area where there is low wages, for sure, but somehow it is most prevalent. That's why we're here today, I think.
We have a lot of people with a ton of equity in their homes right now. They're building additions. They probably have a lot of people coming on their properties. You mentioned short properties. That's a lot of people. Is there people who may not think this applies to them who should be watching out for this sort of thing?
Definitely. Obviously, we're coming from the worker's perspective here. But same way I could take you to a short building and find you tax fraud, we could probably walk into any household in San Diego County and somebody's related to that family that's being taken advantage of. I think it's something that we all need to be comfortable talking about at the dinner table or over Zoom with their family or familias, right? And actually giving them access to where they could get help. I mean, they could go to the labor commissioner's office. They could obviously call the district attorney's office. And worst case scenario, go to the police station and find out what you could do about your wages being stolen. There's no difference between my wages being stolen on a check or you coming into my pocket and taking the money out of it. And so I'm sure that there's somebody out there that's willing to help. All you got to do is take that first step forward.
Just one thing on that, because the policy of sanctuary policy gets very controversial, right? And I don't think it makes any sense in the world in that federal immigration laws ought to be enforced by federal immigration agencies. But I don't believe local law enforcement ought to be enforcing federal immigration law. But when you have that fear, you can't tell an immigrant who is unsure of their status to go to the police department and say, my wages are being stolen, because they're terrified that they're going to get deported.
That's right.
You know, and so we know exhaustive studies, sanctuary cities are safer. They're statistically safer than non-sanctuary because there is a higher level of that trust. But right now, even though we may be sanctuary, because of what we're coming out of in the Trump era and all the rhetoric around that, immigrants are fearful, man. To tell them to go to the cop and say someone stole their money, they're like, no, man, you go tell them someone. So I'm not going to go tell them someone. They're going to deport me. And that's where we've got to restore that trust. I mean, get an immigration system that works, but make sure that trust is there so that worker feels comfortable doing that.
Do you agree with that, that separation, federal, local, is important to establish?
Very important, and I think the more information about it, the better. This is why I think we created this separate, that came out of meeting with these guys and many groups, is the idea of having a direct access to our office and to providing a number and an email and getting those reports. And we kind of waited, and within a month we got 11 of them. So I think it shows, and the police departments haven't gotten those reports, so it shows that yes, there is something to giving that direct access away from where they may be concerned.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. Dan, David, you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, just one other, a key element here. I mean, we talk a lot about enforcement, we talk a lot about policies. I think, we have the psychology of our communities in regards to just the issue of dignity and respect. And I mean, so much of the work that my staff does in regards to working on these cases, obviously we're trying to put solid cases so we can bring them to an enforcement agency, but really at the root of it is really just a question of dealing with people on a human level and being able to instill the concept of dignity and respect. And I think that we really need to be very cognizant that if we don't grab onto that, if our communities suffer as a whole, when we have a large chunk of the population that feel like they're working without dignity, where we're not respect. I mean, there's their psychological ripple effect, and so I think it's really important to continue the work we're doing, because that impacts all of us. I mean, the psychological impact to the community, to have people that are around you that are feeling like they don't have a dignified workplace, that are not treated with respect. I think we all end up suffering from that. It's the air we start to breathe, where your neighbor is suffering. And so there's obviously the legal aspect. I mean, this is the stuff we're working, but I tap on a lot on just the psychology, on the respect, on the dignity, on these elements that are really critical as a community, as a society.
Well, it's been a great discussion. I think one thing I like to do always is make a pitch. My job, my career, I've built a life of trying to expose things that are wrong, trying to find things out that are injustices, or just explain incredibly complex situations. I've learned a lot. If you are interested in that kind of work, please, you can always submit tips or ideas for stories at voiceofsandiego.org, or you can sign up for our newsletters. The morning reports are our most popular product. Go to voiceofsandiego.org/newsletters. Any last words to bring us home, Dan?
I'd just like to say that we talked a lot about the workers, and that's important. This is what this is mainly about. But I want to end where I started. Don't forget about the damage it does to your community. Mm-hmm. We always talk about we either don't have time or money to do things. I'd ask Nathan, what could you do in this county if you had another couple $100 million that came in just because it was supposed to be coming in tax dollars? You could do some great things for San Diego.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks on behalf of the community, and let us know if you see anything weird going on.